Hey, this is Josh. Welcome to my garage. In this video, I am going into crunch mode to finish the biggest mechanical project I've ever attempted, which is building a replacement engine for my Z06. It was May of last year when I blew Goldie's stock LS7 at the racetrack, and as I got towed back to the paddock, you could see that the confidence I had built over the course of this GT3 killer project was gone in an instant. My automotive soul had left my body, and I didn't even know it. A few days later, Ben Collins, the Stig from Top Gear himself, talked to me about his favorite cars while hustling me around the track in a Ferrari 488. So that revived my spirits a bit, and my mom says that's her favorite video on the channel. And you know, in the world of YouTube, and in life in general, it's easier than you think to make lemonade out of your lemons. So I pulled the heads and concluded that I'd suffered the infamous dropped exhaust valve issue that has been the scourge of C6 Z06s for years. I dug deeper and discovered my block was cracked, confirming that I needed a new engine. With the help of Jeff, my old school gearhead father-in-law, I pulled the dead motor in my garage. Then my Corvette enthusiast friend Trent, aka Mr. Meticulous, encouraged me to build a new engine myself, starting with a short block. At the urging of a viewer, I contacted Katech, and they set me up with a refurbished LS7 block with fresh internals, including forged pistons, a foundation capable of 700 naturally aspirated horsepower, should I choose to push it that far. They also put together a DIY kit for me, something I doubt they've done before, so that I could do a big chunk of the work myself. And finally, my friend Dr. Bobby, who comes from the drag racing world, volunteered to help guide me through the process. And it's been slow going. We got the new block on its stand, we installed some parts from Improved Racing to prevent oil starvation, and we replaced the factory rocker arm trunnions. That's not a lot of progress for 3 wrenching sessions. Well, in my career as a video game developer, I've learned that there's nothing like a deadline to motivate you to get across the finish line. And with the anniversary of Goldie's demise coming up, I decided that a deadline is just what this project needs. So right now, I'm going to make you a promise. It was Cinco de Mayo last year when I blew my motor. Goldie is going to be back on the road before May 5th, which means it's time for some nights and weekends, and it begins with building this engine.
Son of a...
Let's get started. Welcome back to the garage. Since Katech was kind enough to do the hard part for me and provide a short block for the low price of $11,000, my part of the engine build starts with the camshaft. And my special guest, Dr. Bobby, returns to supervise. Katech advertises their Track Attack LS7 short block as being capable of over 750 horsepower compared to 500 from the factory. But I don't want 700 horsepower. Well, it's not that I don't want it. I don't want all the headache and expense that comes with it. I budgeted $20,000 to get Goldie back on the road, the same as Chevy would have charged to install a new LS7 back when you could still get one. That sounds like a lot of money, but it adds up so fast. Even with my budget-conscious approach, I should still see right around 600 horsepower at the crank, which I'm going to be very happy with. And it will be reliable, which, as you can imagine, has become a huge priority for me. With that in mind, Katech helped me choose their touring cam, which will give me a little bit of chop while keeping good street manners and going easy on my valve train when I rev this all the way to 7,000 RPM.
Okay, we got her.
It's time to install the cam retainer plate, and I want to mention that I'm following a book called How to Rebuild GM LS Series Engines. If you want to tackle a similar job yourself, I'd highly recommend that book. I'll put a link in the description. Even though I'm not showing every single step on video, please know that I was very careful and I always use proper torque specs for every fastener. Also, I want to point out a strange phenomenon. Despite my channel recently reaching 750,000 total views, that's 80,000 hours of watch time, I have less than 7,000 subscribers. What I think is happening is that viewers are getting so stimulated, so entertained, that they're literally passing out before they can subscribe. I just wanted to warn you so you can be ready. Next up, we're going to time the crank to the camshaft, which requires us to turn the crank, which requires a crank bolt. An LS is really easy to time. First, we rotate the crank so the red dot is at 12 o'clock.
You want to take a look and see if that seems...
That's close enough, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The cam gear aligns with the cam, and then you use the gear to rotate the camshaft so the dot on the gear is at 6 o'clock and matches the dot on the crank. Then you put the chain on the gear and slip it over the crank.
So when you go, drop the chain under, have the cam gear kind of rotated towards you, the top towards you.
I think that's it.
That is on the money.
It looks like things have been going pretty smoothly so far, but we're about to hit a snag. Katech was kind enough to send a bag of fasteners with the DIY kit they put together, and I just assumed that was all the fasteners I needed. False. We need bolts for the chain dampener, and the only ones we have are on the old engine, and they're buried behind the oil pump, which is behind the front cover, which is behind the crank pulley, and the crank pulley can be a real pain to remove. And this just illustrates how on just about any project, unexpected tasks pop up.
Not moving.
All right, got a breaker bar?
Ready?
Yep. Yep, hold on. Yep.
I'm not going to punish you guys by showing you how long some of these unexpected tasks take. Let's just say some of them take a very long time.
If not, we might pour more heat to it in a minute, but...
Can you grab that for me?
Yes! There it goes, it's moving the
Is
crank.
it moving?
Yeah,
Okay, good.
Yeah. I just hope the shaft slides out now.
Don't burn my floor! This might be the moment, Bobby. You ready?
Oh!
Crank pulleys are just my nemesis, man.
Yeah, we're right there. There it is. Got it.
Okay, nice.
Got it.
Okay.
There you go.
And those are the bolts we want.
At this point, I think I realized that I couldn't lean on Dr. Bobby every step of the way. So this was the last we'll see of Bobby in this video, but he promised he'll come back when it's time to put the engine in the car. Wish me luck. The kit included a new rear cover, but not a new front cover, so this one will be going on the new engine, but not looking all greasy and grimy. Next is the oil pump, and because the C6 Z06 has a dry sump, the oil pump is a little different from a wet sump pump. The oil pump wasn't going to fit over the crank bolt, nor is it going on with the oil pan snugged in place. There are teeth on the crank that mesh with gears in the pump, and it's a little tricky to get everything aligned. But don't torque it down until you've checked the alignment with the block, because it needs to sit flush. It can't protrude past the block, or terrible things might happen. We're ready to seal up the front and rear of the engine, which means the front and rear crank seals need to be installed in the front and rear covers. The rear seal instructions say that it is critically important that the seal face out, and they have text printed indicating which side is out, and I must be getting old because it took me about 5 minutes to find that text. Where do you think the bolts are for the rear cover? Hint, they are not in the bag of fasteners. To get to the old rear cover, I need to get the clutch and flywheel off. We can't be putting dirty bolts on our fresh new engine, can we? To get the bolts started, thread them a couple of turns through the gasket. Don't shove them through, and they'll stay in place as you position the cover. Don't do what I did and torque the cover down without checking the alignment of the cover with the block. Or you might need to loosen everything and retorque it. Time for the front cover. I love my Benchmade bug-out pocket knife, but the flip mechanism just isn't as smooth as it used to be. You can fool me once, but I'm not going to torque the front cover until I have it aligned, and I can't align it until the crank pulley is installed. Since I got an ATI Super Damper harmonic balancer, it needs to be assembled before it can be installed, and I was surprised when the instructions said that some torquing would be required. I guess we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. If you only vaguely know what you're doing, like I do, installing a crank pulley can really suck. You can't use your crank bolt to just torque it on because the bolt isn't long enough to engage enough threads in the crank, and you could end up ripping threads out of your crank, which would be an absolute disaster. So there's a special tool you use. I'm using a box wrench to rotate the installer tool, which engages all the threads in the crank and pulls the balancer on. But since the box wrench isn't very long, I don't have a lot of leverage and I have to apply a lot of pressure. Pushing that hard not only hurt my hand, but it also gave me the impression that I was at risk of breaking something. So I kept stopping and checking to see if I was making any progress, which made for an unpleasant experience.
I just don't like doing this.
I took a break, and I'm glad I did because I realized that I had the balancer on far enough that I could use the crank bolt to get it on the rest of the way. But that brought up the problem of how to prevent the crank from spinning freely, and I decided to try using a radiator fan tool I bought for my BMW, and I was kind of shocked that it actually fit. Not only did it fit, but it worked. And my big boy torque wrench gave me way more leverage on the crank bolt than I had with the little box wrench. So I could apply a lot more torque with a lot less effort, and what had previously seemed dramatic and dangerous was suddenly easy. So while I love having help in the garage, sometimes I do learn lessons more thoroughly when I have to solve problems by myself. With the ATI Super Damper harmonic balancer / crank pulley installed, I could finally align the front cover and torque it down. We've got the rear cover on, we've got the front cover on, we're ready for the oil pan, and all we need is a fresh oil pan gasket, which I have, and oil pan bolts, which...
Do I have oil pan bolts?
The reason I was dejected was because I was imagining having to lift the engine off the ground to get at the oil pan bolts. But inspired by the spirit of Dr. Bobby, I tried the shade tree method, which worked just fine. And after a break for dinner, it was time to clean up those nasty old bolts and get the oil pan installed. The only tricky part about the oil pan install is that the spots where the front and rear covers meet the oil pan are prone to leaking, so you need to add some extra RTV sealant in those spots. Like most middle-aged American men, I have an old tube of RTV in my cabinet, and because it's old, the tip of the tube has a dried-up plug in it. Well, let me tell you what not to do in that situation. Don't ram a little screwdriver in and out repeatedly, because then you'll have little bits of dried RTV in the fresh sealant and you'll worry that it couldn't possibly seal properly. But the gods must have been smiling on me because I squeezed my tube so hard that it split open, and from that new opening flowed fresh, clean RTV, just as our ancestors used. Crisis averted. So we're now on day 3 of this process, and on this day I only have less than an hour in the garage, but I wanted to see if I could knock out the lifter install. And it turns out this was such a pleasant experience, I wanted to present it to you as roughly 90 seconds of mechanical ASMR. Enjoy. It is finally time to install the cylinder heads, and I ran into a little issue that set me back a couple of days. There are dowel pins that go in the block, 2 for each head, and one of mine was missing. Guess how much a new pin cost? $7. And I had to wait to get it from Summit since nobody had it locally that I could find. Now I understand why Katech didn't include every single fastener, because that bag would have cost me $2,000. These cylinder heads are built by Katech using stock LS7 cores, and they are truly works of art. I need to get them prepped for install, and that means brake cleaner, which I also bought from Summit in a vain attempt to get my order total high enough to qualify for free shipping. Having a new engine in your garage means taking time to admire the shiny parts and marvel at the engineering, and also say a little prayer for those exhaust valves, hoping that they are going to remain attached to their valve stems forever. I lubed up my knife with WD-40 when I had it out earlier, and now it smells good and flips so fast I'm going to have to get used to it again. I found myself experiencing an irrational fear that the heads would spring off the block and shatter on the floor. It feels like we're in the home stretch. To install the cylinder heads, I've got an ARP head stud kit, which uses studs instead of bolts like the factory. It's a pretty involved process, and it's critical that you do it properly, so I highly suggest double checking the instructions at every step. Tip from Dr. Bobby that also turned up in my book: use tape to cover the intake openings on the heads. Speaking of Dr. Bobby, that's him calling.
Oh, taping up the head.
Because if you drop something down there, it will make its way all the way into the cylinder, and it will be a huge time suck to fish it out. We're just about ready to torque down these heads. ARP says that in order to get proper torque values, the textured side of the washer and the spot where it contacts the head need to be completely free of oil. We already cleaned the head, but now we need to clean the washers.
Son of a...
One hiccup I ran into is that Katech didn't send the lubricant that ARP includes in the kit. Luckily, I had saved an old packet from years ago when I was working on my C6 Z06. Getting there. Guess I still need to practice. And the goal here is to apply a little bit of fastener lube to the faces of each of these nuts. Bobby took issue with what I said in the last video about his 4th grade humor. He says it is 8th grade humor, which is obviously way more sophisticated. Anyway, now that we've lubed our nuts properly, we also want to lube the washers and get started installing the nuts, but we're not torquing them yet because the torque process for our nuts is very specific. This is where you can tell that Josh is growing as a mechanic, because old Josh would have found a 6-point socket that would fit these 12-point nuts and just made that work. But new Josh went to the hardware store and got the proper sizes of 12-point sockets, mostly because I don't think I could live with myself if my new engine died due to not properly torquing my nuts. I'll be here all week, ladies and gentlemen. Please tip your bartender. And in all seriousness, improperly torquing your heads could lead to all kinds of problems, so print out the instructions and follow them to the T. The heads are officially installed, so now it's time for push rods and rockers. We need to lube up the tips of the push rods, and now I wish I had tracked down my dad's oiling can when he passed away a few years ago, because this syringe method I came up with isn't nearly as cool. But don't worry, because pressing in the push rods is immensely satisfying. The rockers should be bathed in oil to make sure the bearings are nice and lubricated, and for some reason, this reminds me of marinating barbecue chicken.
What's up, baby?
For cylinder heads where rocker pivot supports are not a machined part of the head, this is the case with most LS heads, lay the rocker stands in place. I'm assuming I don't have rocker stands, so I'm not like most LS's.
Correct.
Cool. Okay, thanks, man.
Sounds good. Later.
Bye.
The rocker install itself is a bit complicated and hard to film because to do it right you need to make sure you get the crank in the right position for each rocker, so I would refer you to the book if you want specific instructions. And now's the time when I realize I have a fully functional valve train in this engine and I can turn the crank a few times, opening and closing those valves, and imagining all the amazing noises Goldie is going to make when she's back on the road. We are now in the home stretch, but before I can call this engine assembled, I need to get the valve covers on, and since I'm reusing my old ones, I need to clean them up. I also need new valve cover gaskets. Just as I was torquing the covers down, my daughter turned up. She was asking how long the car has been up on the quick jacks, and I can't believe it's been almost a year.
Do you want to do the honors?
Which way do I turn?
So you turn it like this until you feel it kind of pop.
Okay. How does it pop?
You'll feel it. There it was.
Oh.
Good work. Thank you.
And so I did end up getting a little more help in the garage, and that meant a lot to me, even if she couldn't care less. And you know what? I take that back. Right now, where I'm sitting, I've got less than 2 weeks to get this motor in the car. I'm feeling very stressed. But by telling these stories and putting them on YouTube, I'm also building kind of a time machine. So Charlotte, if you're watching this maybe 30 years from now, you might understand a little bit how that moment with you in the garage was the most important part of this entire build to me. And we got to share it with the world, and maybe we made a stranger's day a little bit better. Thank you for coming along for the ride. I'll see you next time.